I just bought 200 acres of raw, sun-baked dirt for $2,000. Yeah, you heard that right, $2,000. And 48 hours later, I had a woman in 5-inch designer heels stomping across my property line like she was leading an infantry charge. She shoves this thick, leather-bound binder into my chest, her perfume clashing violently with the scent of sagebrush and dry earth, and looks me dead in the eye before saying, and quote, "Mr. Sterling, you and Oppos, we're currently $18,000 behind on your mandatory association dues and architectural violation fines, and we expect a cashier in Oppos' check by Friday." End quote. I looked around at the horizon, at the endless stretch of Wyoming prairie where the only neighbors I had were a few confused-looking pronghorns and the whistling wind, and I just had to laugh because there wasn't in Oppos a house in sight for miles, let alone a suburban neighborhood with a homeowners association. But she wasn't in Oppos. Joking, and she didn't in Oppos. Realized that she'd just picked a fight with a guy who spent the last 15 years pulling apart rusted diesel engines with his bare hands and has zero patience for people who try to play God with a piece of paper. My name's Silas, and up until 6 months ago, my entire world was the size of a grease-stained pit underneath Peterbilt's and Kenworth's, breathing in enough exhaust fumes to probably shave a decade off my life. I've been a mechanic since I was 18, saving every penny, living in a cramped apartment that smelled like WD-40, just waiting for the day I could finally see the sky without a roof in the way. When my Uncle Jesse passed and left me a bit of money, I didn't in Oppos to go buy a flashy truck or a boat. I went hunting for dirt, and I found it at a government tax auction in a remote corner of Wyoming where the county was desperate to get anyone, to take over the back taxes on a massive, forgotten parcel. It was 200.6 acres of beautiful, rugged nothingness. And when the gavel hit the desk and the clerk told me it was mine for the cost of a used motorcycle, I felt like I'd finally beaten the system. I drove out there on a Tuesday, the windows of my old Chevy rolled down, the smell of rain-drenched grass filling the cab, and I stood on a ridge looking over what was finally mine, planning where the barn would go and where I'd plant the first rows of winter wheat. But then I saw it, about a half-mile to the west, perched on a hill like a glass and steel fortress, was this massive, modern mansion that looked like it belonged in the Hollywood Hills, not the High Plains. I didn't in Oppos think much of it at the time, figured it was just some tech billionaire hiding from the world, until the next morning when I was out there with a transit level and a shovel, and I heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. A black Range Rover pulls up right to my temporary fence line, and out pops this woman, Victoria Vance. She's dressed like she's going to a gala in New York, not walking onto a dusty ranch. She doesn't in Oppos say hello. She doesn't in Oppos welcome me to the area. She just starts talking about, in quote, community standards, in quote, and in quote, aesthetic harmony, in quote, and how my presence on the land is currently, in quote, non-compliant, end quote. I'm standing there in my work boots and a torn t-shirt, sweating under the prairie sun, and I ask her what in the world she's talking about. And that's when the binder comes out. She claims my land is part of the, end quote, Hidden Ridge Estates, end quote, an exclusive residential enclave she and her husband, Julian, founded a few years back, and apparently, just because I bought the land at a tax auction doesn't in Oppos mean I'm exempt from their, end quote, pre-existing covenants, end quote. According to her, I owe for road maintenance on a road I don in Oppos, to use security fees for a gate that I ascend into Oppos, on my property, and, in quote, visual blight, end quote, fines because my old truck is parked where people from the mansion might see it. I told her as politely as a grease monkey can to get off my property before she ruined her shoes, but she just gave me this chilling, practiced smile and said, and quote, we've handled people like you before, Silas, and we always win. The law is on our side, even if common sense ISN and Oppos. End quote. She left me with a stack of paperwork that looked official enough to scare a normal person. But I've spent my life looking at blueprints and technical manuals, and something about the font and the way the dates were lined up felt off. That night, I sat on my tailgate with a lukewarm beer, looking at the lights of their mansion on the hill, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach, the one you get when you know a storm is coming. I'm not a litigious guy, but I'm a thorough one, so the next morning I didn't in Oppos head to the field. I headed to the county records office in a town 30 miles away that was basically one main street and a post office. I met this lady there, Martha, who'd been filing deeds since the 70s and had eyes that could see through a brick wall. When I told her my parcel number and mentioned Victoria Vance, she didn't oppose to even look up from her coffee. She just sighed and said, and quote, "You're the third person they tried to annex this year, honey, but you're the first one who didn't oppose. T come in here crying." End quote. Martha pulls the original plat maps, big dusty sheets of vellum that smell like history, and we spend 4 hours digging through the fine print of the 1950s ranching divisions. It turns out my land was part of the original, end quote, Ironwood Ranch, end quote, and it had a specific ironclad, end quote, agricultural superiority clause, end quote, written into the deed by the state legislature back when they were trying to protect food production from sprawl. What Victoria didn't oppose, T tell me, was that her, end quote, Hidden Ridge Estates, end quote, was actually built on a carved-out piece of land that had specifically waived those rights, but my land, the 200 acres I now owned, was legally untouchable by any residential association. Even better, Martha finds a document filed just 2 weeks before the auction, and, end quote, encroachment and covenant extension, end quote, signed by what was supposed to be the previous owner, a guy named Elias Thorne. Only problem was Elias Thorne had died in a nursing home in Oregon 3 months before that document was supposedly notarized in Wyoming. They had forged a dead man and oppose signature to try and seize control of the land before the auction even happened, thinking they could scare off any buyer or just absorb the property for themselves. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was better than any cup of coffee. They weren't and oppose, T just being, end quote, annoying neighbors, end quote. They were committing felony-level document fraud and wire fraud because they'd been sending these bills through the mail. I walked out of that office with certified copies and a plan that was going to do more than just get them off my back. It was going to take down their entire house of cards. But Victoria and Julian weren't and oppose, T done playing dirty. While I was at the courthouse, they'd been busy. I got back to my land to find a, end quote, cease and desist, end quote, order taped to my fence, and a massive pile of gravel dumped right in the middle of my access point, blocking me from getting my equipment in. Then the phone call started, not from them, but from people claiming to be from the, end quote, Environmental Protection Board, end quote, and, end quote, County Safety Inspection, end quote, accusing me of illegal dumping and, end quote, menacing behavior, end quote. They were trying to swamp me with bureaucracy, hoping I'd just take a payout and leave so they could have their, end quote, pristine view, end quote, back. Julian Vance even showed up in his Tesla, idling at the edge of the dirt, filming me with his phone and yelling about how I was, end quote, devaluing his investment, end quote, and that I'd be, end quote, hearing from his lawyers in New York, end quote. I didn't oppose, TL back. I just pulled out my own phone and started recording the gravel pile, making sure to get his face and his car in the shot, and I called a friend of mine from the old days, a guy named Miller who used to be a private investigator before he got tired of following cheating spouses. Miller spent 48 hours digging into the Vance and Oppo's background, and what he found was a trail of wreckage from Seattle to Scottsdale. They were, end quote, boutique developers, end quote, who specialized in buying rural land, creating fake HOAs to harass the surrounding ranchers into selling for pennies on the dollar, and then flipping the consolidated land to luxury resort companies. They'd done it 4 times already, and they had a, end quote, management company, end quote, that was just a shell corporation used to funnel, end quote, dues, end quote, into their personal offshore accounts. The turning point came on a Friday evening, the air thick with the smell of ozone and an incoming thunderstorm. I was working on a fence post when Victoria marched back over, this time with a guy who looked like a bodyguard in a suit that was way too hot for the weather. She handed me a, and quote, final notice of foreclosure, end quote, claiming the HOA was seizing the land due to unpaid fines, and she had the audacity to tell me that if I left quietly, they wouldn't and oppose to pursue criminal charges for my, end quote, harassment, end quote, of their members. I looked at the bodyguard, then back at her, and I just smiled, a slow, oily grin that usually meant I'd found the source of a catastrophic engine failure. And I said, end quote, Victoria, I think you should know that I spent the morning with the FBI's Regional Fraud Task Force, and they were really interested in how Elias Thorne signed that covenant 3 months after he was buried." End quote. The color drained from her face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. Her hand started shaking just a tiny bit, but she tried to double down, yelling about how I didn't into oppos. Tino, who I was dealing with, and that they had friends in the state capitol. But I had the records, I had the trail of fake bills, and most importantly, I had a recorded confession from A in quote. Subcontractor in quote. Julian had hired to dump the gravel who didn't into oppos. T1 go to jail for them. I told her that she had 24 hours to remove the gravel, pay for the damage to my fence, and sign a legal waiver never to set foot on my land again, or I'd hand the file over to the U.S. attorney. She didn't into oppos. T wait 24 hours. That night, under the cover of the storm, I watched from my cabin as the Range Rover and a flatbed truck cleared the gravel and vanished into the darkness. But I'm not a guy who lets a fire smolder. I sent the file anyway. 3 weeks later, I watched from my ridge as federal agents swarmed that glass mansion, hauling out boxes of documents and leading Julian and Victoria away in handcuffs. Turns out, they'd bilked a dozen elderly ranchers out of their life savings using the same HOA scam. The mansion is empty now, the glass reflecting the Wyoming sunset, and the HOA is legally dissolved, replaced by a community trust that I helped organize with the neighbors they've been bullying for years. Now, when I'm out there in the mornings, the only sound I hear is the cattle and the wind, and there's a certain kind of peace that comes from knowing the dirt under your boots is truly yours. It makes me wonder, though, how many other people are sitting on a piece of land right now, feeling bullied by someone with a fancy title and a leather binder, not realizing that the law is a tool that works both ways if you're willing to get your hands dirty. I keep that binder Victoria gave me in my barn, not because I need the paperwork, but to remind me that no matter how much money someone has, they can't forge a signature on the truth. So, I've got to ask you guys, have you ever dealt with a neighbor or an association that thought they owned the world just because they had a louder voice? Is an HOA ever actually a good thing, or is it just a way for people with too much time and not enough character to play king of the hill? I want to hear your stories in the comments. Tell me about the time you stood your ground, because out here, your word and your land are all you've really got, and I think it's time we started taking both a lot more seriously. Give the video a like if you think those scammers got exactly what they deserved, and Don and Oppos. Forget to subscribe. We've got a lot more dirt to cover and a lot more stories to tell from the high country.